Starting off at number 5, we have Nagaro, Japan. If you were to travel out to this sleepy valley village in remote Japan, you might see a lot of elderly folks working the land, putting up signposts, playing with children. However, your eyes would be playing tricks on you. A majority of the hundreds of Nagaro residents are actually creepy human-sized dolls. They are everywhere. They fill the schoolhouse, they toil in the fields, they hang out in the town. You're pretty likely to wave hello at one before realizing you've just extended a friendly greeting to a scarecrow. The town had around 300 human residents at one point, but as is the case in a lot of Japanese villages, the population has dwindled. Young people have left for better jobs in bigger cities, and many of the elderly residents have passed away. These days, there are only about 30 people living in the village. If these dolls ever gained sentience, I'd say it would be over for the humans in Nagaro. So you might be wondering where the dolls come from. They couldn't have just appeared one day, could they? Lucky for us, they do have a rational creator. Tsukimi Ayano makes the dolls, and recently she's started inviting people to workshops to make even more. Ayano moved back to Nagaro after living in Osaka for most of her life. The first doll she ever made was actually supposed to be a scarecrow to keep birds away from her house. The original was modeled after her dad, and soon after she was making similar figures and images of all sorts of villagers. It's an interesting memorial project, filling up an empty village with dolls who look like deceased residents. Maybe someday the spirits will return to their vessels and live in the village as they did when they were alive. Imagine a village of living dolls. Yikes. I can only imagine what it would be like at night. Dolls moving in and out of your peripheral vision as you hear children singing by the schoolyard. Off in the distance, a hammer echoes through the valleys. You hear muffled shuffling behind you. The dolls are tired of being made of straw and paper. They want a real human body again. I'll never look at a scarecrow the same way. Up next at number 4, we have the Bielefeld Hospital. Abandoned buildings are usually bad news at night. Nothing good could ever come from visiting a crumbling edifice during the witching hour. You never know who or what could be lurking. Abandoned hospitals are even worse news, considering all of the death, pain, and suffering that have transpired within. And this abandoned hospital in particular had a whole host of reasons not to visit at night. The Bielefeld has a long history behind its haunting. Way back in 1898, it was used as a sanatorium for lung diseases, tuberculosis and the like. As it housed those poor breathing impaired Germans, I am certain it saw its fair share of suffering and death. Medical science has come a long way, but back then, tuberculosis was pretty much a painful death sentence. A lot of this would have happened before the iron lung was invented in the 1920s too, so it's not looking too good for these patients. So now we have an old sanatorium full of ghosts with bad lungs. What else? Soon it became a field hospital for treating German casualties during the First World War. This was around the time that machine guns and mustard gas were first being used, so I would imagine it was quite gruesome. Now we've got soldiers both young and old, both going into the Bielefeld. At one point it even housed a young injured Adolf Hitler, blinded by gas and wounded in the leg. Then in 1945, the Russians occupied it during World War II, taking it as a field hospital once again. So we have lung patient ghosts, German soldier ghosts, Russian soldier ghosts. That's a pretty wild mix of spirits. No, not that kind of Russian spirit. Nowadays, the complex is shut down and the elements have started to take over. The forest is creeping in and it has become dilapidated as hell. They give tours of some of the main areas with a canopy pathway, which, it's kind of lame. But don't worry, they've hidden the good stuff from the public. An intrepid adventurer could sneak past the barricades and potentially run into some of the phantoms in the crumbling hallways. But I would never suggest that to you. That would be illegal. Coming in at number 3, we have Mkami Manor. It's very likely you've already heard about this one recently. It went viral for offering $20,000 to anybody who can complete it, with a $500 penalty for every failed challenge and use of profanity. Don't get too excited, you haunted house aficionados, because this is no regular spook show. Mkami Manor is an extreme haunted house that operates year-round. Over 24,000 people are chomping at the bit for a chance to test their mettle, yet not one single person has made it through. How is this possible, you ask? Well, it's literal torture. Visitors can expect to be drenched in fake blood, screamed at by actors, locked in tiny freezers, put underwater, dragged across concrete, and more. In fact, there's a pretty rigorous screening process that involves one of the most insane waivers I have ever seen. Actually, this waiver is probably the most insane thing experienced lawyers have seen too. Here are a few excerpts just to give you an idea of what exactly is going on here. Once a participant enters or Mkami Manor, there is no quitting unless serious physical or psychological injury is present. Injuries may occur during the tour of which include, but not limited to, head, neck, and back injuries, death, stroke, traumatic brain injury, brain aneurysms, cerebral or retinal hemorrhage, subdural hematoma, loss of consciousness, whiplash, harmful heart reactions, nausea, headache, dizziness, lacerations, broken or sprained bones, torn ligaments, bleeding wounds, scrapes and or cuts, heat stroke, or drowning. Their tour may include the use of hypodermic needles, zappers, tasers, or dog shock collars. A nail may pierce their hand may be smashed with tools. Medication may be given that includes hallucinations or sedatives given in pill form or by hypodermic. They may be fish hooked, which may inadvertently cause rippage to the mouth area. They may have a tooth extracted without Novocaine. They will be participating in various medieval torture devices such as knife throwing while strapped to a spinning wheel. MK Ultra or mind control may be used. Water torture may be used. And those are just some of the things on this crazy waiver. There's been some controversy around Mkami Manor's hiring practices and also how they screen their participants. So I would just stay away in general unless you're looking to hear the screams of people being tortured. And if you're thinking about trying it out yourself, just don't. I'm looking out for you here. Number 2. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. This West Virginian manor opened with only the best of intentions. Thomas Story Kirkbride was a doctor and crusader for the mentally ill who founded the American Psychiatric Association. His goal was to treat asylum patients in a more humane way for better results. He built the asylum to offer the patients more freedom, light, and fresh air. And if everything went to plan, it would have been wonderful. However, after being built, mental health illnesses were diagnosed more often, and there were major stigmas surrounding this. As such, the asylum was totally overpopulated. 5 patients in every 1 patient bedroom. Malnourishment on a wide scale. These factors exacerbated the mental illnesses that the patients already had. By 1938, the asylum was 6 times over capacity, with patients running wild and orderlies unable to stay in control. At its peak, the 300-person facility was holding 2,600 patients. That means that patients were sleeping on floors and freezing rooms. The windows were filthy, the walls disintegrating. Many patients were being locked in cages, and the more unruly ones were being lobotomized through Walter Freeman's ice pick method. That's when they take an ice pick shaped instrument and push it through your eye socket to disconnect the frontal lobe, and it renders you functional but totally zombie-like. By the time the asylum closed, the only wing that was expanded was the graveyard. Those poor patients. Tours are given in the main parts of the asylum, and many ghost hunters claim to feel the presence of the hundreds who died in awful conditions. There are many ghost stories abound, including ones about a little girl who was born and lived in the asylum and a mysterious woman floating through the kitchen. It has been said that if you are in the right room at the right time of night, you can hear the shouts and hollers of patients from years gone by. And finally, at number 1, the Catacombs of Paris. If you didn't already know, there are kilometers of limestone passageways underneath Paris, filled to the brim with human remains. After the city's graveyards overflowed, allowing corpses to spill into the streets, a military officer decided that piling all the excess bodies and remains down in the limestone tunnels was a good idea. So now we have underground passages lovingly decorated with the bones of Parisian ancestors. How fun. Being around human remains at night is already pretty scary, and being in dark tunnels full of them cannot be too fun. But there are way more scary stories about the catacombs than one would expect. About 2 kilometers are open to the public on a regular day, but beyond the state-sanctioned skeletons, there is so much more to explore. It is very easy to get lost among the tunnels and pits and bones, and many people actually have done just that. In 2017, a couple teenagers were lost for 3 days, and they were found suffering from hypothermia. Even scarier is the famous uncovered video camera story. In the early 90s, a group of catacomb explorers found a beat-up old video camera. There was footage still inside the camera of a man who was very clearly lost and alone in the catacombs. He seemed to be going mad trying to find his way out of the massive network by the light of his camera. It ends with him dropping the camera on the ground, and to this day nobody knows what happened to him. Poor guy should have brought a map. Some say the horror movie As Above, So Below was inspired by this event. There are so many more stories of secret societies, mysterious voices, and underground swimming holes that would be enough to creep out the most cynical of thrill seekers. Maybe someday we can take a deeper dive into the horror that is the catacombs. Coming in at number 5, we've got the Freeling House from Poltergeist. An iconic visage in a sleepy neighborhood, the Freeling House stands out in moviegoers' minds even years after Poltergeist ended its theatrical run. The movie, directed by Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg, is a classic by all accounts. However, most of the iconography stems from the interior shots, which were done at a soundstage. The house itself was largely used for exterior shots, establishing shots, the move-in, the swimming pool, but these were enough to burn the seemingly average house's facade into the brains of all who watched. The suburban atmosphere made anyone who watched it relate in some way. That could be your house causing you ghostly problems. This is classic Spielberg. He liked things looking normal and residential. In fact, the area that this house is situated in is colloquially known as Spielbergia, as a few of his films were shot there. The original house still stands, but now has residents living within. It was built around the time that Poltergeist was being filmed, and before the homeowners moved in, the film crew got their footage at the empty abode. Again, it was mostly exterior shots, but the implication of horror remains. You might be wondering how they managed to do the shot where the house collapses into a portal, especially if the house is still standing. Well, they didn't actually blow up the house. I'm sure the current homeowner appreciates that fact. No, instead they made a replica atop an industrial vacuum rigged with wires. Plus, they shot it with shotguns when the cameras started rolling. It's a lot of fun, to be honest, and the effect was great. You can technically visit the Freeling House today. It's located in a community near Colma, California, and folks have become acclimated to horror heads rolling through for a picture or two. Just don't be a nuisance and don't try to get inside. Oh, and just in case you were wondering, there is a swimming pool in the back. Whether or not there are skeletons floating around is up for debate though. Folks might claim that they've seen some paranormal activity stemming from the house, but no proof of this has ever appeared. It's likely just people seeing what they want to after watching the movie, but hey. Coming in at number 4, we've got South Pasadena suburbs from Halloween. Speaking of that suburban feel, why not visit the real Haddonfield? Of course, Haddonfield is a made-up place intended for use as a backdrop for the murderous activities of Michael Myers, but the houses we see, both belonging to the Myers and Strode families, are real. They're not in Illinois though. They both sit snugly among the white picket fences in Pasadena. Halloween was one of the first horror movies to bring the scares home, and by that I mean by placing Michael Myers in this supposedly safe and sleepy suburban oasis, it made everyone afraid of their own neighborhoods. The veneer of quiet safety was tarnished, and nothing could be the same. So visiting this neighborhood and walking home to the Strode residence is kind of like witnessing the birth of modern suburban horror. Isn't that fun? Try not to imagine Michael though, mask on, knife in hand, jumpsuit zipped, creeping around the corners, although you might actually see him behind every hedge. Maybe it's a hallucination, who knows. That's hard to avoid. Apparently the folks that live at Laurie Strode's old place keep a pumpkin out on the porch for people who might want to snap some photos. That's nice. Still, get too close and you might find yourself in the sights of a mask-wearing lunatic. Michael's childhood home has a bit of a different look these days though. It's actually been converted into a chiropractic office, so you can get your spine snapped in a much more beneficial way. The thing is, I don't know if I could ever relax enough to have my back cracked in the Myers home. Could you? Coming in at number 3, we've got the Dakota Hotel from Rosemary's Baby. If you've got a couple cool millions lying around, maybe you'd find yourself living alongside some eerily friendly Satanists. That's right, Rosemary's Baby was filmed at the Dakota Hotel, located at 72nd and Central Park West in New York City. It's gorgeous, sure, but the price tag of any real estate in New York is astronomical. Still, it is nice to look at all that from the outside. In Rosemary's Baby, it becomes the Bramford. Young Rosemary and her hubby Guy move in, excited to start anew in a lovely location. At first, the place is a little sketchy, but they make it their own. Too bad the local chapter of Satanists have their eyes on the young couple, eh? Well, you know what happens next. Throughout the years, many famous individuals have lived at the Dakota, from Lauren Bacall to Judy Garland to Maury Povich to John Madden. The most famous of all would probably be John Lennon and Yoko Ono, to whom the Dakota owes a great deal of infamy. While standing under the archway, John Lennon was murdered by Mark David Chapman. There aren't any direct connections between the movie and Chapman, but he was a man obsessed with religion. He saw Lennon as a phony, in Holden Caulfield's terms, for preaching messages of peace and love while still joking about being bigger than Jesus and owning millions of dollars worth of things. Chapman was trying to work on his relationship with God, and he wasn't sure whether or not he was going to kill Lennon, but in the end he did, and did so on the steps of a hotel famous for housing fictional devil worshippers. Draw your own conclusions about that one. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Timberline Lodge from The Shining. A far cry from the real Overlook Hotel, the Timberline served as the exterior for one of the most iconic lodges of all time. Built upon Oregon's Mount Hood back in the 30s, this lodge is now a National Historic Landmark. In fact, it was originally meant to help put Americans back to work during the Great Depression. These days, it's better known for housing the Torrances in their darkest hour. Interestingly enough, Stephen King envisioned a totally different hotel while writing his legendary novel. After staying at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, he was inspired to pen the now famous tale. But the Timberline was immortalized in Stanley Kubrick's filmic adaptation and thus remains the face of The Shining. A beautiful lodge overlooking snow-capped mountains, the Timberline would be a lovely place to vacation. Year-round skiing is a wonderful prospect, isn't it? But the ties to malevolent spirits and axe murderers are hard to shake. That hasn't stopped folks from flocking to the hotel though. All sorts of people spend their leisure time at the Timberline, even specifically requesting the room 217 featured in King's novel. However, room 237 featured in the movie doesn't actually exist, so good luck booking a room up there. If you do end up spending time at the Timberline, make sure you do it while a lot of other guests are guaranteed to be around, otherwise you might start dreaming up specters and spirits, both paranormal and liquid. And don't get me started on the bloody elevators. Coming in at number 1, we've got the Seneca Creek State Park from the Blair Witch Project. Sure, it's a great place for a hike, but are you really gonna risk running into whatever evil entity did away with the 3 documentarians from the found footage classic? Over 6,300 acres of foliage and fear await you. You can kayak, fish, and geocache to your little heart's content, but just keep an eye out for strange happenings. If you see any odd structures, it's probably a good idea to head in the opposite direction. Realistically, you'll be alright if you choose to spend some time here. Fresh air is good for you after all, just be careful. Hell, you might even run into some more found footage filmmakers during your time here. They might not be faking it though. Who knows what copycats might get up to these days. Don't read too far into the Blair Witch lore before heading out. You might find yourself on edge during the entirety of your adventure. And staying overnight? Probably a bad call. Just in case, you know?
Coming in at 5, the Sultans Palace. At 716 Dauphine Street in the French quarter of New Orleans stands a 4-story home housing one of the most unusual yet terrifying ghosts, the Sultan. Built in 1836 by Jean-Baptiste Laprette, a plantation owner who rented out his city home when he was experiencing a shortage of cash. However, the man he rented it out to was a little odd. His name was Prince Suleiman, a Turk who claimed to be the Sultan of a Mid-Eastern country. He had many wives and family members as well as slaves and servants. Now things started to get a little weird when folks began reporting that not only did the Sultan's harem consist of many women but also young boys, with stories of orgies and kidnappings quickly surfacing. However, things took a truly gruesome turn when a passing neighbor made an early morning discovery. They noticed the house was particularly quiet and saw blood dripping from the gallery oozing out of the front door. He contacted the police and what they found would haunt them forever. Body parts were strewn all over the house, which was also covered in blood. Women, children and guards were slaughtered and beheaded. However, there was one body that had been left untouched. The Sultan. He had been buried alive with one hand reaching up through the dirt, almost as if he was trying to claw his way out. The identity of the murderer still remains a mystery to this day, and as of today, his angry spirit is said to roam the home, creating unusual noises, playing loud music, as well as making unwelcome advances on passing female residents. Coming in at 4, the Queen Mary, Long Beach, California. The RMS Queen Mary is a retired British ocean liner that sailed the North Atlantic Ocean between 1936 and 1967 for the Cunard White Star Line. She was built by John Brown and Company in Scotland along with RMS Queen Elizabeth, with the ships being built as a planned 2-ship weekly express service between Southampton and New York. However, with the outbreak of the Second World War, Queen Mary was converted into a troop ship and ferried Allied soldiers during the war. Following that, she was refitted as a passenger service before retiring completely in 1967, during which time she she sailed from Southampton to the port of Long Beach, California, where she remains permanently moored. However, since that day, claims have been made that the ship is haunted, with Time magazine including it among its top 10 haunted places. According to some reports, one of the staterooms is alleged to be haunted by the spirit of a person murdered there, supposedly anyway. The Queen Mary also explicitly promotes suite room B340, which was a former third-class cabin, as, I quote, notoriously haunted. Many ghost tours take place in the ship, including Dark Harbour, which operates during Halloween. As it stands, up to 50 deaths have been logged on the Queen Mary, which truly makes her one of the most haunted ships in history. Coming in at 3, Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia. Also known as ESP, this is a former American prison located in Pennsylvania and was operational from 1829 to 1971. America's most notorious criminals lived in these walls, including Al Capone and bank robber Willie Sutton. Initially designed by John Haviland, Eastern State is considered to be the world's first true penitentiary and was renowned for its revolutionary system of incarceration, also known as the Pennsylvania system, or separate system, which encouraged separate confinement for inmates as a form of rehabilitation. Inmates were housed in cells that could only be accessed by a small door that led to an equally as small exercise yard attached to the back of the prison. Rumor has it the doors were small so prisoners would have a harder time attempting to get out, thus minimizing the chances of a guard getting attacked, while others have suggested the small doors forced prisoners to bow while entering or exiting their cells, which is related to penance and ties in with the religious inspiration of the prison. When an inmate would leave the cell, his head would be covered with a hood, so he couldn't see or be seen by others. However, by 1913, the penitentiary was forced to abandon its solitary system due to overcrowding, before closing its doors entirely in 1970. As of today, the penitentiary welcomes thousands of visitors yearly for both its museum and ghost tours, with some folks reporting paranormal happenings including disembodied laughter, shadowy figures, and pacing footsteps. Coming in at 2, St. Augustine Lighthouse, Florida. This lighthouse is a private aid to navigation and an active working lighthouse in Florida, and was built between 1871 and 1874. As it stands, nearly 225,000 people visit the lighthouse annually, due to its reputation for otherworldly visitors. The lighthouse has had many tragedies over the years, with one of its many ghosts rumored to be that of a lighthouse keeper who fell to his death while painting the tower. Not only that, but 3 young girls also drowned when their cart they were playing on broke and fell into the ocean, with some visitors claiming to hear the sounds of children playing in and around the lighthouse. This haunted location has been featured in episodes of the sci-fi series Ghost Hunters, as well as My Ghost Story. However, researcher Joan Nichol, who investigated the lighthouse, has stated that there is no credible evidence the place is haunted, and instead noted that the spooky noises are just seagulls or even the wind. Party pooper. And finally, coming in at number 1, Leap Castle Island. Leap Castle, yep, it's pronounced Leap, is a castle located in Calgary County, Offaly Island. Now, there are varied accounts of when the castle came to be, with most sources pointing to the 13th century or even as late as the 15th century. Now, it was originally built by the O'Bannon clan before ruling was taken over by the O'Carroll clan. However, all was not well within the castle. Legend has it that during a struggle for power within the clan during the 1530s, one member plunged a sword into his brother, a priest, while he was holding mass in the castle chapel. The butchered priest fell across the altar and passed away in front of his family. The room is now formally known as the Bloody Chapel, with many witnesses claiming to have spotted the priest haunting the area at night. However, that's not all. The castle's history is incredibly macabre. During renovations in the early 1900s, a few workmen stumbled across a secret dungeon in the Bloody Chapel that was housing human skeletons that filled 3 cartloads when hauled away. The dungeon was designed in a way that prisoners would fall through a trapdoor and instantly have their lungs punctured by wooden spikes at the bottom, ultimately dying a slow and painful death. Many tourists have also spoken of a red lady who is reported to walk the halls at night holding a dagger. The castle has become notorious around the globe, with media flocking to capture its paranormal offerings, including ABC Family's Scariest Places on Earth and Living TV's Most Haunted.
Kicking off at number 5, Building 2283, Okinawa. Throughout modern history and following the events of World War II, Japan has seen a large military occupation, the majority of which come from the US. Because of that, these collisions of culture have been met with some pretty spooky outcomes. One of those is Building 2283 at the Kadena Air Base, which is actually a single unit family home in a residential area, which was historically reserved for mid-grade officers and high-ranking civilians. Well, of course, no one lives there anymore, and the Kadena Air Base goes out of their way to make sure the building is eerily maintained. Whatever happened before the US moved in is unclear, but tales of a grisly murder are the main consensus. A number of families occupied the residence, but all of them soon reported the same stories. Water faucets and lights turning on and off by themselves, the sound of children laughing and crying just out of earshot, and the sight of a woman washing her hair constantly in the utility sink. Allegedly, the origin of the haunting comes from a family who occupied the house sometime in the late 70s, a teenage girl who was obsessed with keeping herself clean, and an abusive stepfather that stabbed her to death and then killed himself. Next up at number 4, Gridley Tunnel, Yokosuka. Again, another ghostly tale that comes from the military. The Gridley Tunnel on the Yokosuka Naval Base is a narrow, one-way tunnel that runs directly underneath a hill from Gridley Lane to Nimitz Boulevard, an access route running away from Yokosuka that was repurposed from an ancient fortification that existed before the modern naval base was built in the 1870s. Allegedly, the staggering amount of the exact same sighting is what has given this ghost its legend. As people drive through the one-way tunnel, they glance in the rearview mirror and see a bloody samurai chasing them. Some people have been so startled by the sighting that they've totaled their vehicle into the side of the tunnel, and the ghostly samurai often emerges on rainy nights between midnight and 1 AM. As the legend goes, the apparition is the ghost of a long-dead samurai who was on his way to avenge the death of his feudal lord when he was ambushed by the same assassins and brutally killed. Allegedly, because he failed his mission of vengeance, he cannot leave the tunnel and is left to wander eternally. Coming in at number 3, the Hanging Ruins, Osaka. In the Shinsekai district of Osaka, there lies the remains of a burned out 4-story building that has eerily been dubbed by locals as the Hanging Ruins. As the legend goes, in the early 2000s, the apartment building burned out in a tragic fire, where it remained for years untouched and unrepaired. In 2005, an employee of a local spa located from across the ruins spotted a strange long object dangling from its roof. Well, the employee decided to call the authorities, who investigated and realised that the strange object was in fact a corpse. The next day, there was a mysterious pair of shoes dangling from where the body was found. A few years later, another local was passing by and they spotted what appeared to be a life-size doll hanging from the same rooftop. Eerily enough, it turned out to be yet another corpse, and yet again another mysterious pair of shoes were found dangling the next day. Eventually, curious folks started throwing pairs of shoes from the building in tribute to the mysterious corpses found there. As far as the residents of Osaka are concerned, there have been at least 3 bodies found in the Hanging Ruins, yet who they were or what they were remains a mystery. Swinging in at number 2, the Doryodo Ruins, Tokyo. Doryodo, also referred to as the Haunted Temple of Hashioji and translates roughly to the End of the Road Temple, is known as one of the most haunted locations in Japan and has been host to some grisly and ghostly tales throughout its history, ever since it was first constructed in 1590. As one of its many legends goes, in 1963, an 82-year-old woman who was in charge of maintaining the site was approached by a robber. The woman tried to fight back against the criminal and was tragically killed as a result. Days later, locals reported the ghostly sounds of a woman sobbing in the forest, a spirit that was tragically bound to the ruins. Exactly 10 years later, in 1973, a female university student was caught up in an affair with her English literature professor, who was married and had 2 small children. When word of the affair got out, things ended tragically, and the professor ultimately killed the young girl, burying her body in a shallow grave at the site of the Doryodo Ruins. It didn't end there though. The act of murder drove the professor to madness, and weeks later, the corpse of him, his wife, and his 2 children were found washed up by some nearby cliffs. To this day, locals have reported hearing a young woman whispering, I'm here," alongside the sound of an old woman sobbing. And finally, at our number 1 spot, Ekkogohara Forest, Yamananshi. Of course, it has to be perhaps the most notorious and infamous location in the whole of Japan. Ekkogohara Forest, also known as the Sea of Trees, is a beautiful location that historically has harboured a very dark and eerie past. Since the 1800s, the forest, which sits in the shadow of Mount Fuji, has had a reputation with being a gateway for the Yurei, the ghosts of the dead in Japanese mythology, and has been revered as a location and site for communicating with spirits. It was also connected to the ancient practice of ubusute, a mythical Japanese practice where an elderly person was taken to a forest to die. It wasn't until 1961 that the forest began its grisly reputation with suicide, when a famous Japanese writer, Seiko Matsumoto, penned the novel Nami no To, Tower of Waves, where the lead characters tragically committed suicide in the confines of the forest. In 2010, more than 200 people attempted to take their own lives in the forest, and tragically, that figure continues to rise as Japan struggles to confront its staggering suicide rate and battle with mental illness. Ekkogohara Forest continues to be a human reminder of these lives lost and the tormented spirits that still linger there.
Coming in at number 5, we have the Bangara Fort, India. The Bangara Fort is a 17th century fort built in Rajasthan, India, originally being built by the Bhagwant Das for his younger son Madho Singh. According to legend, a Sudu, also known as a holy person, named Baba Balak Nath lived within the fort area, and it was his injunction that any house built in the precinct of the fort should not be taller than his own, and if the shadow of any such house fell on his, it would result in destruction of the fort. Another tale states that a wizard adept in black magic fell in love with a beautiful princess who had many suitors. One day the wizard followed her to the marketplace and offered her a love potion. However, she refused, throwing it onto a large rock that consequently rolled onto the wizard and was said to have crushed him to death. However, before his death, it was said that the disgruntled sorcerer put a curse on the fort, which resulted in folks fleeing and the site remaining uninhabited. If you prefer your vacations to be on the spiritual side, you can visit the fort. However, its crumbling rocks and abandoned structures make it incredibly unsettling. You have been warned. Coming in at number 4, we have the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel, Canada. The Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel is an historic hotel located in Banff, Alberta, aka one of my favourite places on earth. Got it right here. Banff. The entire town is situated in Banff National Park, with the hotel overlooking a valley towards Mount Rundle. The hotel opened its doors back in 1888 by the Canadian Pacific Railway as one of the earliest of Canada's Grand Railway hotels. In 1926, though, a fire destroyed the original structure, with a replacement being built in 1928. As of right now, the hotel welcomes many tourists from around the world who want to explore the beauty of Banff. However, it gets a tad more gothic once you get inside the hotel. The Calgary Herald has reported that the hotel houses several ghosts, including a bride who was said to have fallen down the stone staircase during her wedding, which is tragic and absolutely devastating. However, there is a less upsetting one. Sam the bellman is also said to be a lingering ghost at the Banff Springs Hotel. He worked there until 1975 and claimed he would come back to haunt the hotel after he was gone, and that he did. According to some, he supposedly pulls shifts to help people with their bags before disappearing into thin air. In at number 3, Obvodny Canal, St. Petersburg, Russia. Obvodny Canal is the longest canal in St. Petersburg, Russia, which in the 19th century served as the southern limit of the city. The canal was dug in 1769, and by the late 19th century, after the Industrial Revolution, it had effectively become a sewer collecting wastewater of adjacent industrial enterprises. Nowadays, the channel is very shallow. Navigation is allowed, but only for small crafts. Running 5 miles through the city, the canal since goes by another name, a much more sinister name, Suicide Canal. Ever since the canal's construction back in the 18th century, strange events have surrounded the area, some of which included the construction workers complaining of headaches, sudden outbursts of violence, and of course, as the name states, suicides. Now, while most attempts were successful, those who survived their attempts have claimed that they didn't know why they jumped in the water, and that it felt as though an invisible force was pulling them off the banks and into the murky depths. Some even claim that the force comes comes from the restless souls lurking beneath the water, with some survivors even claiming to see a woman in white floating in the water before suddenly disappearing. Very spooky indeed. So if you ever find yourself in St. Petersburg, I would suggest steering clear of the Obvodny Canal. Coming in at number 2, the Stanley Hotel, Colorado. The Stanley Hotel is a colonial revival hotel located in Colorado, approximately 5 miles from the Rocky Mountain National Park. The hotel was built by Freeland Oscar Stanley of Stanley Steamer fame and opened its doors on July 4, 1909 as a resort for upper-class Easterners and a health retreat for sufferers of pulmonary tuberculosis. Now, more importantly, the Stanley Hotel served as the inspiration for the Overlook Hotel in Stephen King's novel The Shining, as well as the filming location for the 1997 miniseries. In the fall of 1974, Stephen King and his wife stopped for a night at the old hotel, during which time the hotel had fallen on hard times and was a ghost of its former self. Upon arriving, King learned that the hotel was closing for the winter and that only a skeleton crew would remain. Despite that, the couple checked into room 217, the presidential suite, and were the only paying customers there at the time. That night, according to King, he had a nightmare in which he saw his young son being chased down the hallway of the hotel by a possessed fire hose. He woke up in a sweat, stepped onto the balcony for a cigarette, and by the time he went back inside, he had worked out the bones for what would eventually be his third novel, The Shining. Honestly, that story gives me chills. Despite a peaceful early history in the years following the release of The Shining, the hotel gained a reputation as a setting for paranormal activity. Not to mention, it has hosted numerous paranormal investigators appearing in shows such as Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures. On top of that, the hotel offers guided tours which features spaces reputed to be exceptionally haunted. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have Castle of Good Hope, Cape Town, South Africa. The Castle of Good Hope, known to the Cape Town residents as the Castle, is a fort built all the way back in the 17th century by the Dutch East Indian Company and is the oldest existing building in South Africa. The fort was built to act as a replenishment station for ships passing the treacherous coast around the Cape on voyages between the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. The fortress was said to have housed a church, a bakery, workshops, living quarters, shop cells, and various other facilities. In 1936, the castle was declared an historical monument, making it the first site in South Africa to be protected. However, like the rest of the numbers on this list, the castle is home to some otherworldly residents. Back in the 1700s, Governor Peter van Noot was said to have condemned several men to be hanged to death, with one of the men cursing the governor from the gallows. Creepier still, Van Noot went on to die later that day of a heart attack. According to the official website of the castle, his ghost has been haunting the grounds ever since.